The greatest prison you will ever face has no walls, no locks, and no guards. It lives behind your own eyes. Most people spend their lives believing that success is a matter of talent, luck, timing, or opportunity. They search for better jobs, stronger bodies, smarter strategies, and perfect moments, convinced that the next achievement will finally bring them peace. Yet every morning they wake up carrying the same invisible weight. They promise themselves that today will be different. Today they will finally become disciplined. Today they will stop procrastinating. Today they will take control of their future. But by the time the sun begins to set, those promises have quietly disappeared, replaced by familiar excuses whispered so softly they almost sound like reason. It is not because they lack intelligence. It is not because they were born weaker than everyone else. It is because they are fighting the wrong battle. The greatest enemy has never been outside of you. It has never been your boss, your childhood, your failures, your fears, or the people who doubted you. The greatest enemy has always been the version of yourself that chooses comfort over growth, certainty over courage, and habit over transformation. Every decision you make strengthens one of two people living inside you. One version quietly waits for permission to become extraordinary. The other works tirelessly to keep everything exactly the way it is. One speaks with conviction. The other speaks with excuses. One embraces discomfort because it understands that every difficult step builds a stronger foundation. The other protects temporary comfort, even when that comfort slowly steals an entire lifetime. The tragedy is not that most people choose the weaker voice. The tragedy is that they never realize they are choosing at all. They mistake automatic reactions for personality. They mistake repeated habits for identity. They mistake fear for wisdom. Then they spend years wondering why nothing changes while repeating the same decisions that created the life they wish to escape. This silent war is happening right now, whether you acknowledge it or not. Every distraction is a test. Every delay is a decision. Every compromise shapes the person you will become tomorrow. There are no spectators in this battle. Every breath is a vote for your future self or your former self. Long before modern psychology attempted to explain the mind, one man understood this conflict with extraordinary clarity. He did not become legendary because he defeated opponents. He became legendary because he refused to let the enemy within command his life. His victories began long before anyone witnessed them. They began in silence, where no audience could applaud, where no reward could be seen, where the only witness was the man staring back from his own reflection. That truth has echoed across centuries because it is as real today as it was then. Before you can master your career, your relationships, your ambitions, or your future, you must first confront the only opponent who follows you everywhere you go. And for one ordinary American named Ethan Walker, that confrontation was about to begin in the most unexpected way, with a single moment that shattered everything he believed about himself. But before Ethan could understand the man he was capable of becoming, he would first have to meet the man who had been quietly controlling his life all along. Ethan Walker looked like a man who had everything under control. Every weekday began at exactly 6 o'clock. His alarm rang once. He got out of bed. He showered, poured a cup of black coffee, and drove through the same streets to the same office where people respected him for being dependable. His performance reviews were solid. His bills were paid on time. His neighbors greeted him with a smile. From the outside, his life appeared stable, even successful. But stability is not the same as fulfillment, and routine is not the same as purpose. Every evening he returned home carrying something heavier than his laptop. It was the quiet feeling that another day had slipped away without becoming meaningful. He owned books about discipline that still smelled new because he had never finished them. Exercise equipment gathered dust in the corner of his apartment because tomorrow always sounded more reasonable than today. Business ideas filled the notes application on his phone, each one abandoned before it had the chance to become real. Ethan never lacked ambition. He lacked authority over himself. Every promise he made in the morning seemed convincing until the first inconvenience arrived. A difficult email became an excuse to delay the workout. A stressful meeting became permission to order unhealthy food. A long afternoon became justification for another evening spent scrolling through endless distractions, telling himself he deserved to relax because tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow became next week. Next week quietly became another year. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan opened an old cardboard box while cleaning his apartment. Inside were journals from nearly 10 years earlier. Curious, he sat on the floor and began turning the pages. The first notebook contained goals he had completely forgotten. Learn another language. Build a business. Run a marathon. Become mentally unshakable. Travel without fear. Every page was filled with determination, detailed plans, and promises written by a younger man who genuinely believed his future was unlimited. Ethan kept reading until his smile disappeared. The same sentences repeated year after year. This is my year. I will finally commit. I will stop making excuses. The handwriting changed slightly, but the promises never did. It felt as though he had been introducing himself to the same unfinished version of his life for an entire decade. In that moment, he realized something deeply unsettling. He had not been standing still. He had been practicing hesitation. Every delay had become a lesson. Every excuse had become a habit. Every habit had slowly become his identity. The prison had not been built in a single day. It had been constructed one comfortable decision at a time. Ethan closed the journal and stared at his own reflection in the dark television screen across the room. For the first time, he did not see an unsuccessful man. He saw a man who had quietly surrendered thousands of small decisions without ever noticing the cost. That realization stayed with him long after the room had fallen silent. Days later, while wandering through a quiet independent bookstore on a rainy afternoon, one weathered book resting alone on a wooden shelf captured his attention, and before he even opened the first page, he sensed that someone from another century already understood the battle he had been losing. Ethan bought the book without reading the back cover. Something about its worn leather binding and faded pages felt different from the polished promises lining every other shelf. It did not advertise quick success. It did not promise happiness in 30 days. It seemed to ask only one question. Are you willing to face yourself without excuses? That evening he placed the book on his kitchen table, brewed a cup of tea, and began reading slowly. The words were simple, yet they carried an unusual weight. They did not offer comfort. They demanded honesty. One sentence stopped him completely. It explained that the greatest obstacle standing before any person is rarely another human being. It is the untrained self that reacts before thinking, hesitates before acting, and seeks comfort before truth. Ethan read the sentence again, then a third time. It was as though someone had quietly described every decision he had made during the past 10 years without ever knowing his name. He had always believed that his circumstances needed to change before his life could improve. Better opportunities, better timing, better motivation, better confidence. But now another possibility appeared before him, one that was far less comfortable. What if nothing outside him had ever been the real problem? What if every delayed dream had begun with one small decision to obey temporary emotion instead of lasting purpose? He closed the book for a moment and looked around his apartment. Nothing had changed. The walls were the same. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. Yet everything felt different because his perspective had shifted. For the first time, he noticed that every object around him reflected repeated choices. The clean dishes represented discipline. The unopened boxes represented avoidance. The unfinished books represented intentions without commitment. His home had quietly become a mirror. Suddenly he understood why so many people spend their lives searching for a new environment. It is easier to move to another city than to confront the habits that travel with you. It is easier to blame circumstances than to question identity. The book described mastery not as controlling other people, but as refusing to become controlled by your own impulses. It suggested that thoughts are not commands. Feelings are not laws. Fear is not prophecy. They are visitors that knock on the door of the mind, waiting for permission to enter. Most people never realize they have the right to leave the door closed. Ethan leaned back in his chair and remembered every promise he had broken to himself. Each one had followed the same invisible pattern. A goal appeared. Excitement followed. Difficulty arrived. Emotion took control. The goal disappeared. He had never actually failed because the dream was impossible. He had failed because he surrendered authority the moment discomfort entered the room. That realization felt strangely liberating. If repeated surrender had built his current identity, then repeated discipline could build another one. Identity was not a gift. It was practice. Character was not discovered. It was trained. As midnight approached, Ethan reached for his notebook instead of his phone. For several minutes he stared at the blank page without writing a single word. Finally, he wrote one quiet sentence that felt less like a goal and more like a promise to the man he hoped to become. I will no longer negotiate with the person I wish to leave behind. He did not know it yet, but that single decision would soon be tested in ways that no book could ever prepare him for. The next morning Ethan woke before sunrise, not because he felt inspired, but because he had made a decision the night before. For a brief moment he lay still, staring at the ceiling as the familiar voice quietly returned. You did not sleep enough. You can begin tomorrow. Missing one morning will not matter. The words sounded reasonable. That was what made them dangerous. They did not arrive as loud temptations. They arrived disguised as logic. Ethan almost listened. His hand reached toward the edge of the bed, then stopped. He remembered the sentence he had written only hours earlier. I will no longer negotiate with the person I wish to leave behind. He stood up anyway. The room was silent except for the steady sound of his breathing. Outside, the streets were nearly empty, the first light stretching across the neighborhood. He laced his running shoes, stepped outside, and began walking with no music, no podcast, no distraction. Every step felt strangely uncomfortable, not because his body was tired, but because his mind kept searching for reasons to return home. As he walked, another realization emerged. The enemy never attacked all at once. It appeared in small conversations that happened entirely inside his own head. One thought suggested checking his phone before beginning the day. Another encouraged him to skip reading because work would be stressful. Another insisted that discipline could wait until life became easier. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they quietly controlled the direction of his life. During the following week, Ethan started noticing 6 invisible chains that had shaped nearly every decision he made. The first was fear, not fear of failure alone, but fear of discovering what he was truly capable of if excuses disappeared. The second was comfort, always inviting him to remain exactly where he was because familiar discomfort somehow felt safer than unfamiliar growth. The third was approval, the exhausting habit of measuring his worth through the opinions of people who rarely thought about him at all. The fourth was impulse, the constant desire to chase whatever felt easiest in the present instead of what mattered most in the future. The fifth was distraction, stealing hours without announcing that anything valuable had been lost. The sixth was excuses, the quiet architect behind every postponed dream. Ethan realized these chains were connected. Fear created excuses. Excuses protected comfort. Comfort welcomed distraction. Distraction strengthened impulse. Impulse increased the need for approval. Together they formed a circle that kept countless people walking in place while believing they were moving forward. He remembered another idea from the old book. Person is rarely defeated in one dramatic moment. More often, defeat arrives through thousands of unnoticed decisions that slowly become identity. That sentence refused to leave his mind. Every ordinary moment suddenly became meaningful. Choosing water instead of another unnecessary cup of coffee was no longer about a drink. Finishing one chapter before checking messages was no longer about reading. Returning the shopping cart instead of leaving it behind was no longer about convenience. Each action became evidence. Every decision answered one silent question. Who is in command today? Ethan finally understood that discipline was never built during extraordinary moments. It was built during ordinary moments repeated with extraordinary consistency. And as the days passed, one unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. Breaking the chains would not require becoming someone new overnight. It would require allowing the old version of himself to quietly disappear, one decision at a time. The first changes in Ethan's life were so small that no one else noticed them. His co-workers still saw the same quiet man arriving at the office each morning. His neighbors still waved as he walked to his car. His family still asked the same questions during weekend phone calls. From the outside, nothing remarkable had happened. But inside, a different conversation had begun. Ethan had stopped asking himself whether he felt ready. Instead, he asked a far more difficult question. What does the person I want to become do next? The answer was almost never exciting. It was never dramatic. It was rarely comfortable. Yet it was always clear. He began making decisions before his emotions had the chance to argue. When the alarm sounded, he stood up before his mind could negotiate. When work became stressful, he took a slow breath instead of reaching for another distraction. When he wanted to delay an important task, he counted backward from 5 and started before doubt could gather enough strength to stop him. At first these actions felt unnatural, almost mechanical. Part of him wondered whether discipline was supposed to feel more inspiring. Then he remembered another principle from the old book. A master does not wait for the perfect state of mind. A master trains the mind to obey what is already known to be right. That single idea changed everything. Ethan realized he had spent years believing that action followed motivation. Now he discovered that motivation often followed action. Every completed promise, no matter how small, strengthened his confidence. Every excuse he refused weakened the authority of his former self. Progress did not arrive as a burst of energy. It arrived quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments repeated day after day. One afternoon, his manager unexpectedly assigned him a demanding project with a tight deadline. Only a month earlier, Ethan would have felt overwhelmed, spent hours worrying about the outcome, and searched for ways to postpone the difficult parts. This time he noticed the familiar wave of anxiety rise inside him, but he did not obey it. He opened a notebook, divided the project into simple steps, and completed the first one before allowing himself to think about the rest. The fear did not disappear immediately. It simply stopped being in charge. That evening, while driving home beneath the fading light of the setting sun, Ethan smiled for a reason he could not fully explain. The project itself was not what mattered. The victory had happened long before the work was finished. It happened the moment he refused to surrender his decisions to temporary emotion. For years he had imagined discipline as a heavy burden, something that restricted freedom. Now he saw the opposite. Every disciplined choice removed another invisible chain. Every promise kept restored a little more trust in himself. He was beginning to understand why lasting transformation could never be purchased, borrowed, or inherited. It had to be earned through thousands of moments when no one was watching. Yet the greatest challenge still remained ahead, because changing daily habits was only the beginning. Sooner or later, every person who chooses a different path must face one final question. Are you willing to let the old version of yourself disappear completely, even if it means leaving behind the identity that once felt familiar? Weeks passed, and Ethan slowly realized that discipline was changing more than his schedule. It was changing the story he told himself every single day. He no longer introduced himself through the language of someday. Someday I will become healthier. Someday I will become confident. Someday I will become the person I know I can be. Those words quietly disappeared from his mind because they belonged to someone who was always waiting for permission to begin. In their place came a different question that followed him everywhere. What would the disciplined version of me choose in this moment? The answer was rarely dramatic, but it was always honest. Sometimes it meant closing the laptop and taking a long walk instead of escaping into endless entertainment. Sometimes it meant admitting a mistake at work without defending his pride. Sometimes it meant sitting in complete silence for 10 minutes simply to observe how quickly his thoughts tried to pull him away from the present. He began noticing something unexpected. The habits he had spent years protecting were not disappearing peacefully. They resisted. The desire to procrastinate returned without warning. Old excuses appeared wearing new disguises. One evening he almost convinced himself that one missed commitment would not matter because he had already made so much progress. Then he paused. He remembered that the old version of himself had always spoken with the same calm voice. It never demanded failure. It only suggested small compromises. Skip today. Delay this one task. Reward yourself first. Begin again tomorrow. The old identity had never survived through dramatic mistakes. It had survived through tiny permissions repeated often enough to become character. Ethan smiled because he finally recognized the pattern. For the first time, he could hear the voice without obeying it. That was the real victory. The battle had never been about eliminating temptation. It had always been about deciding who held authority when temptation arrived. As the seasons changed, people around him began asking simple questions. You seem calmer lately. Have you been exercising more? Did something happen? Ethan found it difficult to explain because nothing extraordinary had happened. No miracle had appeared. No overnight success had transformed his life. The transformation had been almost invisible, built from ordinary decisions stacked one upon another until they quietly became a different identity. He understood something that had escaped him for years. You do not become a new person by chasing a new feeling. You become a new person by refusing to repeat the behaviors that belong to the old one. Every time he honored a commitment instead of an emotion, another piece of his former identity quietly lost its influence. It did not disappear with anger or regret. It simply became unnecessary. Like clothes that no longer fit the person wearing them, the old habits slowly fell away because they no longer matched who he was becoming. Ethan finally understood why true transformation often feels uncomfortable. It is not because growth hurts. It is because every step forward asks you to release a familiar version of yourself, even when that version has kept you safe for years. Only after letting go of the person he had been could he begin discovering the person he had always been capable of becoming. And as that quiet confidence grew stronger each day, another lesson began to reveal itself. One that had nothing to do with winning against others and everything to do with learning how to walk through the world carrying an unshakable peace that no outside circumstance could easily disturb. Months passed, and the most remarkable change in Ethan's life remained invisible to almost everyone around him. He did not suddenly become famous. He did not wake up wealthier. He did not receive constant praise or admiration. In fact, many days looked almost identical to the ones he had lived before. The difference was hidden beneath the surface, where no photograph could capture it and no conversation could fully explain it. He had stopped depending on the world to decide who he was. Every morning he rose before the noise of the day could reach him. He spent a few quiet minutes reading, reflecting, and preparing his mind before stepping into responsibilities that once controlled his emotions. The silence had become more valuable than constant stimulation. He discovered that clarity rarely arrived in crowded moments. It appeared when the mind finally became still enough to hear the truth beneath its own distractions. At work, unexpected problems continued to appear. Deadlines changed. Plans failed. Difficult conversations still happened. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside Ethan. Circumstances no longer determined his character. They simply revealed it. He noticed that while others immediately reacted with frustration or panic, he had learned to pause before responding. That single pause became one of the greatest forms of strength he had ever developed. It gave him the freedom to choose principles instead of impulses. He realized that self-command was not measured by controlling the outside world. It was measured by refusing to become controlled by it. One afternoon, a younger colleague approached him after a meeting and quietly asked, "How do you stay so calm when everything becomes stressful?" Ethan smiled because he remembered asking himself the opposite question for most of his adult life. He thought for a moment before answering. I stopped trying to control everything around me. I started learning how to control my next decision. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it remained with him for the rest of the day. He understood that people are often inspired less by words than by consistent behavior. Quiet discipline speaks with a voice that explanations rarely match. The old book rested on the shelf in his apartment, its pages now marked with notes and reflections. He returned to it often, not because he believed wisdom could be memorized, but because wisdom had to be practiced repeatedly until it became instinct. Every page reminded him that mastery was not an event waiting somewhere in the future. It was a way of walking through ordinary life with intention instead of reaction. Ethan no longer chased the feeling of becoming stronger. He simply honored the next right action, trusting that identity would follow repeated choices. The remarkable truth was that he no longer needed anyone to notice the transformation. Approval had lost its authority. Recognition had lost its power. He understood that the strongest people are often the quietest because they no longer waste energy proving themselves to the world. They are too busy keeping promises to themselves. Looking back, Ethan realized that the greatest victory had never been over fear, distraction, or comfort. It had been over the belief that those forces deserved to lead his life. Yet as liberating as this new way of living had become, one final lesson still waited beyond the horizon. A lesson that would reveal why true freedom is never the reward for an easy life, but the natural consequence of mastering the person you become every single day. As another year quietly unfolded, Ethan finally understood a truth that had once sounded impossible. Freedom was never the absence of responsibility. Freedom was the absence of inner chaos. For years he had believed that being free meant doing whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. Now he saw that this kind of freedom often became another form of captivity. Every uncontrolled impulse demanded attention. Every unnecessary desire pulled the mind in another direction. Every distraction claimed another piece of time that could never be recovered. What looked like freedom from the outside often became slavery from within. Real freedom felt completely different. It appeared the moment he no longer had to argue with himself before doing what he already knew was right. The endless negotiations had faded. The excuses had grown weaker. The voice that once begged for comfort no longer held the same authority because it had been ignored too many times to remain convincing. Ethan noticed this change one quiet Sunday morning while sitting on a park bench watching families, runners, and dog walkers move through their routines. Everyone seemed busy chasing something just beyond reach. More money, more recognition, more certainty, more approval. He realized that he had spent years running the same race without ever asking whether the finish line belonged to him. The old book had never promised wealth, status, or admiration. It had pointed toward something much more valuable. Inner command. A life directed by principles instead of impulses. A mind that could remain steady whether circumstances became favorable or difficult. That kind of freedom could not be taken away by an unexpected setback, a disappointing conversation, or a season of uncertainty because it did not depend on external conditions. It was built from the inside outward. Ethan remembered one simple sentence he had written months earlier in his notebook, almost without thinking. I will no longer negotiate with the person I wish to leave behind. Looking back, he realized that sentence had quietly become the foundation of every meaningful change. It had guided him through ordinary mornings, difficult afternoons, lonely evenings, and moments when nobody would have known if he had chosen the easier path. Character had not been built during extraordinary opportunities. It had been built during invisible moments that nobody applauded. That realization changed the way he looked at every person he met. He stopped envying appearances because he understood that every calm face might hide an unseen battle, and every disciplined life had almost certainly been shaped through thousands of private decisions that the world would never celebrate. The greatest victories rarely made headlines. They happened when someone kept a promise after everyone else had forgotten it. They happened when a person chose patience over impulse, responsibility over comfort, and truth over convenience. Ethan no longer measured progress by how far he had traveled compared to others. He measured it by how often he remained faithful to the person he had chosen to become. That quiet standard gave him a peace that external success alone could never provide. He understood at last that mastery was not a destination waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. It was the daily practice of returning to the highest version of yourself, again and again, until discipline no longer felt like effort but simply became your nature. And once that truth settled deeply into his heart, only one final realization remained, the realization that separates a life merely lived from a life deliberately shaped, a realization that would forever redefine what it truly means to leave this world stronger than the person who first entered it. Years later, if someone had asked Ethan when his life truly changed, he would not have pointed to a promotion, a financial milestone, or a single unforgettable day. He would have remembered an ordinary morning when he chose to stand up instead of listening to another excuse. Looking back, he realized that every meaningful transformation had begun with decisions so small they seemed almost invisible at the time. One choice became another. One promise became another. One disciplined morning quietly became a disciplined life. The world often celebrates dramatic moments because they are easy to see, but the foundations of greatness are almost always built in silence. Long before anyone recognizes strength, strength has already been practiced. Long before confidence becomes visible, it has already been earned through countless private victories. Ethan finally understood that the person he had spent years searching for had never existed somewhere beyond the horizon. That person had been waiting inside every difficult decision he was willing to make. Every moment of patience revealed another piece of him. Every act of responsibility uncovered another layer of character. Every refusal to surrender to comfort shaped a future that once seemed impossible. The old book remained on the shelf, its pages worn from use rather than admiration. It had never offered shortcuts because none existed. It had simply pointed toward a timeless truth. A person who cannot guide his own thoughts will eventually be guided by circumstances. A person who cannot govern his own habits will eventually become governed by them. But the opposite is equally true. The one who learns to direct attention, emotions, and actions with steady intention begins to carry something that no outside force can easily take away. Not perfection, not certainty, something far more valuable. Quiet authority over the self. Ethan no longer measured his days by how comfortable they felt. He measured them by whether he had lived according to the principles he claimed to believe. Some days were difficult. Some plans still failed. Some goals took longer than expected. Yet none of those moments possessed the power they once held because they no longer defined his identity. His identity was defined by the choices he made in response. That was the freedom he had been seeking all along. Not a life without obstacles, but a life in which obstacles no longer determined the direction of his spirit. As the years continued to pass, people occasionally asked him for advice, expecting a secret technique or an extraordinary strategy. Ethan always found himself returning to the same quiet realization. Your future is rarely decided by one extraordinary decision. It is shaped by the ordinary decision you repeat when nobody is watching. Every sunrise offers the same invitation. Every ordinary moment asks the same question. Who will lead your life today, your highest principles or your strongest impulses? The answer is never spoken once. It is written again with every action, every thought, every promise honored, and every excuse refused. In the end, the greatest achievement is not becoming someone the world admires. It is becoming someone your own conscience can trust without hesitation. That is where lasting confidence is born. That is where enduring peace quietly begins. And that is where every ordinary person discovers that the path toward an extraordinary life has never started with changing the world around them, but with becoming the kind of person whose character remains steady enough to change whatever world they choose to enter.